Hi class, this is the continuation of chapter 2A notes. The last time we did atoms and ions. Today we're going to talk about chemical reactions and how they actually are going to combine atoms in different ways. So let's start with chemical reactions. Chemical reactions are making and breaking of bonds, forming new substances. So here you can see that there's a picture of a chemical reaction down there. We call this a chemical equation. It's representing something that actually happens in real life. So we're starting with some hydrogen. Right here, these are two hydrogen molecules. This is H2, each of these is a hydrogen, this is H2, and another H2. Plus, meaning they're going to react together with oxygen gas. The molecules that you start with are called the reactants. Okay, that word is right here and right here. So the reactants are the substances that you start with. You're writing that down. They're the things that are on the beginning part of your equation. We're starting with hydrogen gas and oxygen gas. A chemical reaction is going to occur. We show that with an arrow. That means that bonds are breaking and reforming in a new way. So now these bonds are breaking and these bonds are breaking and these bonds are breaking and they're all rearranging. So now we have one oxygen with two hydrogens. We made water. The thing that you made, or the things that you made, sometimes it's more than one, are called the products. The substances you end with are the products. There are thousands of different chemical reactions that are going on in the world and in your body. And in that, atoms are bonding with different partners than they were before. This is what makes biology work, is all these chemical reactions. Bonds are at the core of that, and so we're going to spend some time talking about bonds now. There are four different main types of bonds that we are going to address. Bonds are atoms or molecules that are attracting to each other. Atoms don't just generally sit around alone. They are participating in bonding and breaking of bonds. So we're going to talk about covalent bonds, ionic bonds, hydrogen bonds, and something called a van der Waals attraction. And you can see the pictures there. So we're going to start with covalent bonds. Covalent are the strongest types of bonds. They are the bonds that hold most of your biological molecules in your body together. You have the other bonds as well, but this is the one that's mostly responsible for holding you together into a living being. In covalent bonds, atoms are sharing electrons. Neither of the atoms has enough. They need some more, so they're going to share with each other. So here you can see this one has one, and this one has one. Each of them needs two. So what they're going to do is share. Now this one has two and this one has two. They're sharing those electrons. That is a nice overlapping strong bond called a covalent bond. Atoms don't always share nicely, just like anyone else in the world doesn't always share nicely. So depending on the strength of the electronegativity of these two atoms, one of them may pull more strongly on the electron, and that's going to lead to different types of covalent bonds. Here are some covalent bonds. Again, we'll talk about the types in a minute. At the top there, you can see they're sharing two electrons, making a hydrogen molecule. Here, two fluorines are sharing. Here, we're having carbon sharing with two oxygens, making some double bonds there. In each case, they're overlapping, they are sharing, they are connected. These are strong, strong covalent bonds. Two types of covalent bonds. The first one is called nonpolar. That's the easiest one to talk about. It's where the atoms are sharing equally. There it is. They're sharing equally right there. When they share equally, that's what's shown right here. The electrons and the protons are between the two different atoms equally. There are no poles. All right, non-polar means no poles. We'll talk about poles in a minute. They share equally. There's no charges. It's just perfect. The other extreme is going to be what is called polar covalent. In a polar covalent bond, or that makes a polar covalent molecule, you are getting oppositely charged sides to a molecule. So like, batteries have poles, a positive pole and a negative pole. It's ends that have charges on them. Molecules can do this too. If one of the atoms is pulling the electron more closely to itself, we're going to get an unequal sharing. And that makes positive and negative ends to molecules. This one right here is doing that. Chlorine is pulling the electrons right here. This is representing the electrons the electrons closer to itself. So this end is going to get a slight negative charge. This end is going to get a slight positive charge. We call that being polar. And this bond right here holding them together is a polar covalent bond. Let's look at an example of each. Here we have an oxygen molecule. They are sharing electrons right here down the middle. We have two pairs of electrons being shared evenly between the two atoms. So this is a nonpolar covalent molecule. This one is a different story. Here the oxygen is pulling the electrons right here more closely to the oxygen end, making it a little bit negative. And then the hydrogen end doesn't have any electrons down here. See that? Only the protons. So this end of the molecule is a little bit more positive. This is a polar covalent bond, making a polar molecule. Water is a perfect example for that. So here we have a little bit of a recap of polar and nonpolar covalent. Nonpolar covalent, right here, these are the electrons. They are shared evenly between these two, so it's not polar, no charges. Here we have those same pair of electrons, but they're pulled a little bit more closely to this end. So this end has a little bit of a negative charge, and this end, where the electrons are not so much, has a partially positive charge. The one on here we haven't talked about yet is where the electrons are all the way moved into one instead of the other. That is what is called an ionic bond. In an ionic bond, you have ions, ionic bond made of ions. That should make sense. So we have happening what we talked about in our previous video, where we're losing or gaining electrons, or we're making charged particles. We now have a positively charged, a positively charged cation, because it lost electrons, and a negatively charged anion. Opposites attract, so the attraction between a cation and an anion, that is called an ionic bond. So here in this picture, same idea. This one gives an electron to this one. One is positive, one is negative. They're attracted. They are attracted to each other and they sit next to one another. That is the definition of an ionic bond. Look at those cute guys. A little positive one and a negative one being attracted to each other. That's the definition of an ionic bond. Another type of bond we're going to look at is called a hydrogen bond. Hydrogen bonds are between molecules, not within molecules. So on the diagram there, these bonds in here are polar covalent. All right, so we already talked about that. Now we're talking about this bond out here that's actually going to hold one molecule to another molecule. It's a little bit of a different kind of bond. Really, really important in biology. You're going to find them in water. We're going to find them in DNA. We're going to find them in a lot of places. But they are joining different molecules to each other temporarily. They are weak bonds, but they are very important because we have a lot of them. So their strength comes in their numbers. There it is right there. Here, water. Right there, these are hydrogen bonds holding water molecules to each other. Did you ever see water molecules on a, or not molecules, but water droplets on a car or on a leaf, and you connect them with your finger, and they like swoosh together into one drop? That is because of hydrogen bonding. What happens is that when the waters get near each other, they're like, ooh, attracting. Hydrogen bonds form in there, and that's what holds them on there. Same idea as the drops on a penny experiment, if you've done that, where they make that dome. That's because the water molecules are attracted to each other by hydrogen bonds. Really important. Van der Waals forces are another weak bond or attraction, but again, can be very important in biological functions because a lot of them add up and can be very strong. Van der Waals forces are very, very short-lived. They only exist for fractions of a second. They're caused when the electrons are moving around in the atoms, and they sometimes join together on one side. And if they do that, sort of what's shown here, right? So if all the electrons are over here for a second, this side of the atom is negative, and this side of the atom has no electrons, so it's positive. And if their neighbor's doing the same thing, we all of a sudden get this positive and negative attraction in the middle. That's a Van der Waals force. The geckos are here because this is how they stick to walls, is because they have all these little tiny little thread-like pieces on the ends of their feet, and each of those little ends can make a whole bunch of Van der Waals forces, and that attraction is strong enough with all of them to make it stick to the wall. One of them is weak, but a lot of them together are strong. All right, so let's do a little bit of reviewing. You're going to do a bonds review on the back of this paper on your own. So let's look at a few examples to give you an idea of what to do. We're not going to look at van der Waals in this case, so our choices are going to be ionic bond, covalent bond, either nonpolar or polar, and then hydrogen bonds. So let's start with this diagram down here, this little molecule that's in the corner. You can see a positively charged end and a negatively charged end. If there are positively charged poles, that should give you a clue that the sharing of electrons, see they're actually overlapped and touching each other here. The sharing of electrons here is covalent, but they're not sharing evenly. That's why this end is positive and this end is negative. So that makes this a polar covalent molecule held together by polar covalent bonds. Let's do this one over here. We have two different atoms. This one is positively charged. Remember, that's called a cation. And over here we have one that has some extra electrons, making it negatively charged. If we have a positively charged ion, that's this one, being attracted to a negatively charged ion, that would make this an ionic bond. Oppositely charged ions attracting is an ionic bond. Up here, we have two hydrogen atoms that are sharing these two electrons in the middle. I don't see any charges forming here. The electrons are not closer to one end or the other, which means that this is going to be nonpolar. Oh my goodness, my writing, sorry about that. And then, because they're sharing, is covalent. Over here, by the process of elimination, you might guess this, but right here we have these bonds that are holding the water molecules to each other. It's a positively charged hydrogen attracting to a negatively charged oxygen. That's the definition of a hydrogen bond, is a positively charged hydrogen attracting to the negative part of another molecule. That makes these hydrogen bonds that are holding this together. All right. That's all there is for that. So now you should be able to do the back of that, and good luck.